So clearly, tonight is about rock stars, and I would include you all in that as well. The women you're going to meet tonight, they shine behind microscopes, they curate huge amounts of data, and their discoveries change what we believe to be true. They change our lives for the better. So we're here to learn from them, and we're going to hear tonight about bowels and brains and bacteria, among other things. And as I mentioned, this panel has been months in the making, and here's what I love about our community. This all was the brainchild of one of my favorite women in the world, Jen Sizemore, who, from Fred Hutch, a total rock star. I promise I'll try not to overuse that phrase tonight, but in this case, it's completely true. And Jen could have done this because she's at Fred Hutch, and they've got tons of great scientists there. And instead, she said, let's do this together as a community. And so she invited the UW and Seattle Children's and the Allen Brain Institute and WGHA, all to come together, and everybody said immediately, what a great idea. Now, the hard thing was for each of those organizations just choosing one scientist to be represented up here tonight. But our community comes together around these ideas. And then it was, who should we do this for? And the unanimous decision was the next generation, for people that we're hoping that those of you here tonight who are thinking, or maybe couldn't even imagine yourself as a scientist, but you'll come out of here tonight just being positive you can do it, that you want to do it, and it's like one of the coolest jobs in the world. So we're really delighted to have many of you here tonight. So let me ask some of you, the younger people in the room, what do you think about what do you imagine when you imagine a scientist? What do you imagine? Exactly. Okay, thank you. White coat. What else? Labs. Good. Couple other things? Writing grants. We're going to get to that tonight, too. That's someone with experience. Could be any of those things. Albert Einstein. Excellent. White, middle-aged male. Okay. Good. I think about microscopes, in labs and things like that. So what you're going to hear tonight is going to challenge some of those assumptions in the way that you think about what a scientist looks like and what a scientist does. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down below here tonight so that the focus can be on our 5 women rock stars here entirely. I'll be asking the questions from there. I'll ask questions for a while, and then there's going to be an opportunity, of course, for Q&A from you all. And then we've got some fun surprises at the end as well. So, and here's what I'm going to say. I love this idea. This is how each of the women, as they come out here tonight, I want you to know. No, I'm going to save this. I'm going to tell you this afterward. So, little tease. So, first of all, I'm going to introduce the panel. And we're going to start with Amy Bernard with the Allen Institute. So Amy joined the Allen Institute in 2005. She's got more than 25 years experience in molecular biology and neuroscience. As a researcher and also as a manager. And before joining the Allen Institute, she was a scientist at the University of Washington. So our second rock star is Dr. Nina Salama from Fred Hutch. So Nina is a microbiologist. She studies a stomach bacteria called H. pylori. It's linked to ulcers and stomach cancer, and stomach cancer is the 3rd leading cancer killer in the world, and I didn't know that until tonight. Next, we have Sumi Jayadev from UW Medicine. I depend on me. So Dr. Jayadev Delighted is a neurogeneticist. Her research is about neurodegeneration. She's trying to develop therapies that can target more specific types of Alzheimer's. And delighted to have you here, Sumi, so thanks. Next up, a real total rock star, Dr. Bonnie Ramsey from Seattle Children's Research Institute.
What you want, baby, I got what you need, you know I got it.
So I love this song for Bonnie because if there's one thing that she has in spades, it is respect. Bonnie is a children's pulmonologist. She's known worldwide for her work developing new therapies for cystic fibrosis. She was one of a team of 3 who invented an inhaled antibiotic to treat pulmonary infections. And she was just elected as a member of the National Academy of Medicine, one of the highest honors in the field. And finally, Tala de los Santos from PAP. So Tala has degrees in genetics and in business. She oversees a team that develops really exciting new diagnostic technologies for diseases like malaria, HIV, polio, and river blindness. And I also want to mention that she was elected a couple of years ago as Washington Global Health Alliance's Rising Leader, which is a high honor as well. So welcome, Tala. Okay, so what's so great about being a scientist? And Amy, let's just start with you.
Sure. Well, thanks everybody for coming out. As Lisa said, it means a lot that there's this kind of support. And what's great about being a scientist, aside from getting to observe new things that you know have never been observed before, is being able to, I guess, motivate and excite others through what you learn and what you discover, and work with groups of people that share the kind of enthusiasm that you have for your particular area of interest. So there's always discoveries, always things to learn, and pretty much if you're a scientist, you just get to do that all the time.
Sumi, you're nodding, you're green.
Yeah, that, especially that last bit about how one of the incredible things about being a scientist is that your job is just basically to learn. Your job is to learn and to think and to synthesize what you learn. And I think when I first thought about going into science when I was in high school, I had considered it to sort of be this intellectual commitment I was making. I'm going to become a scientist and I'm going to lead this sort of dry life. And it turns out to be so much more dynamic and rich and fun and crazy than I ever thought it would be. And so that's what I love about being a scientist, that it just has such potential for being able to explore so many different aspects of life, and not just the little cells that I study in the dish, but everything that we study has implications in our personal lives and our social lives, and it's just a very dynamic platform to be existing in. And someone had mentioned Albert Einstein, and he is sort of the middle-aged white guy scientist. But I think one of the many cool things we can learn about some of our more eccentric scientists is that he really underscored or brought to our attention that there is a great role for mysticism or for spiritualism even in science, that it isn't just a very dry discipline, that it's really just a complement to the ways that we look at the processes of life. So
that's interesting because the head of the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, Francis Collins, writes pretty eloquently about that as well, about that. Bonnie, what about you?
Well, I think that what I've really enjoyed are just the exciting people you get to work with. And I'm a practicing clinician, and I don't actually have a laboratory. My laboratory is clinical trials in patients. But I've had the opportunity to work with just wonderful teams of other scientists, and there's something new constantly. I mean, the technology is so phenomenal. What I'm doing now, I would never in my wildest dreams have even imagined was possible. And yet, every 6 months, something new becomes available. And so it never gets boring. And you know, I can't imagine why anybody would ever want to retire because it's just so exciting. So it's wonderful.
Nina, can you imagine retiring? No, no, answer the first question.
I'm not ready to retire yet, for sure. No, I would echo what has been said before. I'm just a really curious person. And when I was young, I thought I was interested in biology, and I thought the only thing that you could do, I grew up in a small town, in biology was go into medicine, and that was a little off-putting for me because I didn't want to have responsibilities for people's lives. And it wasn't really until I got to college that I got clued into the possibility of research as a career. And, you know, I had no idea if I would make it, but I just love trying to discover new things. And so my mantra has always been, well, I'll just keep going until people tell me I can't do this anymore. And that's kind of how I've gotten to where I am today.
And Tala, talking about the new technologies and things that Bonnie was talking about as well, you're smack in the middle of that.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of, you know, one of the wonderful things about being a scientist, being a researcher is one can channel the sense of wonder that you feel about the world around you. You can channel that, and you can do that every day as your job, as you work with other really brilliant, very passionate people. It's just so amazing and so rewarding. And at the end of the day, too, in my case, we help develop products that are targeted for use in developing countries. So actually developing something that is useful, that could help save lives, and some of the areas where people are really vulnerable or disenfranchised is very powerful to me. And I actually remember sitting one time in a meeting, and we were assessing a technology, whether it is something we should push forward or not, and I was thinking, wow, they're paying me to think about these things. This is so amazing. So I think that's one of the great things about this line of work.
So, Amy, your title is Product Architect at the Allen Institute. You've had a series of unconventional roles that people might find surprising for a scientist. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yes, right now my title at the Allen Institute for Brain Science is Product Architect. And for the Allen Institute, one of the products that we develop is centered around information that we share with the scientific community. So rather than developing a drug or just publishing papers, we're actually trying to create data that can disseminate knowledge. So for us, the product is the knowledge, and one of my roles is to work with all of the different scientific teams, technologists, engineers, as well as the general public of neuroscientists that we seek to have a conversation with, and try to help design and refine the types of data that we generate to be most useful to the community. So it's a completely different thing. Nobody said to me, oh, there's this kind of job out there, and these are the sorts of classes you need to take in order to have that job. It evolves through experience, and it evolves through the opportunities that the scientific community has come to develop, as Bonnie said, through advances in technology and just continual evolution of what it is to be in science today. So before that, I had worked with scientific management, heading up a number of different laboratory teams in the biosciences, teams of molecular biologists, of microscopists, people who work on electrophysiology, which is actually recording from neurons in the brain. I've had the opportunity to work with a large number of different teams in a very collaborative way that's all focused on generating high-quality data that becomes part of these information knowledge products that the Allen Institute creates.
You know, and I think we'll hear you all say tonight over and over, team, team, team. I mean, that this is not done in solo the way people might imagine it. Sumi, you're also working on the brain, and in your case, though, it's around dementia and Alzheimer's. Can you tell a little bit more about what your work?
Yeah, and the field of Alzheimer's and neurology has also benefited immensely from these tremendous technological advances. And so, one of the challenges that I think we realize is that we don't really have a sort of silver bullet for Alzheimer's disease. And what has become apparent is that there are just different types of Alzheimer's disease. We call it Alzheimer's disease, but there are probably many different ways to get there. And now, because of technology, we can actually get really detailed genetic information on people and really start to sort of bin people in terms of having different risks for Alzheimer's disease and different pathways that may be causing their Alzheimer's disease. And that's all through genetic variation, genetic testing. And so that's part of what we do with our research team. And then we take that information and then we study different particular mechanisms in the lab so that we can really dissect out what are, for instance, the inflammatory pathways that are causing Alzheimer's disease. How do you model that in the dish? And then what molecules or drugs can you use to interfere with that inflammation? And so that's what we do. We take that back to the bench and try and find candidate ways to interfere.
So Nina, you're also thinking about inflammation, but in this case in stomach bacteria and how it can lead to ulcers and cancer. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I love Helicobacter pylori. It's fascinating in
Can
many.
you say that fast 3 times, please?
many ways. But so we have. There's been a recent appreciation that we have this whole community of bacteria that live on and in us, and do many useful functions for us, like help digest our food, but some of them can cause trouble. And Helicobacter pylori is one of these bacteria that can cause trouble. But interestingly, its only home is in the human stomach. And people used to think that there were no bacteria that lived in the stomach because of its acidity. And so this bacteria was only discovered in the 1980s. And prove the point that bacteria can live anywhere. And so a lot of what my work is focused on is how did this bacteria adapt to live in this seemingly hostile environment? And why do some people that carry this bacterium get ulcers or cancer, whereas most people that carry it don't? And it turns out it's a really complex equation that has both, that there's different types of bacteria that differ at the molecular level. As we just heard, people have different genetics, and then we also have different diets, and all these factors work together to cause the risk for disease. And so just trying to dissect these different parts of the program. My work personally is more focused on the bacterial side because I just love bacteria.
So I think that for those of you interested in, I've heard this now in talking with Nina before this event, and she does mention that love a lot, and she talks about the shape and the corkscrew and how it. So great to talk with her more afterward if you want more detail. I think there's no end of enthusiasm there, which is terrific. Bonnie, you've been working for quite a while on cystic fibrosis, but in different ways. And maybe you could talk about that evolution of your work, because now you're working on the microbiome and thinking about that, and explain what that even means to those of us non-scientists.
So cystic fibrosis is a genetic disease and results in infections in the lung and inability to digest food. And it still is a fatal disease, but when I started, it was fatal at around 12 to 15 years of age. And now we have patients living into their 50s and 60s. So it's been an incredibly dramatic change. But just the way you love bacteria, my bacteria is something called Pseudomonas aeruginosa, and it's a bacteria that, for some reason, had an advantage in cystic fibrosis. It would beat out everything else. And so my interest actually initially was in fighting these infections. And so we determined that the infections were on the surface, very much like in the GI tract, only this is in the lung. And therefore, the best way to treat them was to put really high antibiotics directly onto the lung rather than having you get an IV. And so that's why we developed inhaled antibiotics. And it was for cystic fibrosis, but now the whole field of inhaled antibiotics is, across medicine. So it was really a platform. You were talking about a platform. It was for developing that. But that just treated the symptoms. What's happened in the last 2 decades is that there have been drugs developed to actually treat the abnormal protein in cystic fibrosis, which is called CFTR. And I've had the honor of being part of all those studies as well. And that has completely changed the disease. So that I think over the next couple decades, you're going to see that patients continue to live longer and longer. But it's been quite a journey, a fun journey.
And Tala, you've got, as I mentioned in your introduction, you've got degrees in both science and business, and you're an inventor, and that's got to be really interesting. So can you talk a little bit about some of the sorts of things, maybe frustrating at times? I don't know, but talk about your work in developing diagnostics.
So you mentioned the word team earlier. So what I do really is I oversee a team of scientists and engineers and public health researchers and business strategists. So it's really our team together that develops these diagnostic tools. So while you guys like your bacteria, I like my parasites. So some of the work that we do, for example, is developing these diagnostic tools, diagnostic tests, to look for parasites that infect people in some of the most remote parts of the world. So the thing about working in diagnostics is that you don't work on any one particular disease, you work across. So I think maybe I'll pick out one of my favorites, a recent test that we helped develop and eventually bring to market with our industry partners. It's a test for a disease called river blindness, also called onchocerciasis, but for most people, river blindness is easier to say. It's river blindness. It's caused by a parasite that lives in the skin, and they go to all over the place, but some end up in the eyes, and over time they do cause blindness in people infected, and they affect people who are at the prime of their lives. So in the past, people would abandon vast tracts of land, fertile farmland, because they were so afraid of this disease, and this disease wreaked havoc in the GDPs of many developing countries. So, fast forward to many years and the different controls that people have put in place for this disease, we are coming in at the end of a wonderful story in global health about the potential elimination of this disease, that we have actually now the real chance to wipe this disease off the face of this earth. We have the drugs that are available to treat them. We have the programs that are bringing these drugs all over the world to all of these communities who live not just at the end of the road, but beyond the end of the road. And now we're developing the diagnostic tools to help monitor the progress of that, the control and elimination of this disease. So that's the kind of work that I do, and I love my parasites for that. This work in diagnostics, I mean, we take it for granted, I think, often here. If we go to the doctor and we get a test, often they'll be able to tell us what's wrong with us. But more and more things that we assume, like we're Alzheimer's or something, can be parsed out. It's true with malaria, broadly, this hugely impactful disease where people are diagnosed as having malaria because they have fevers and things, but that's not actually what is wrong with them. So they're treated with the wrong thing for the wrong disease. And then as we learn more because of the work that the 5 of you and many others are doing, we're being able to parse that out more and more specifically. So I'd like to ask all 5 of you to raise your hand if you knew that this is the sort of thing you'd be working on when you graduated from college. Because I think that there's I would imagine when I was in high school, I would look at the people in my science class. I was pre-med, and that lasted a quarter at the U. And I was completely intimidated by the people in my classes, and I just thought they were born knowing.
that this is what they were going to do, and they were scientists at the core or going to be doctors, and it was this unwavering path. Right. And the more of you that are working in this field that I meet, obviously, it was wrong, and maybe if I'd stuck with it after tanking in chemistry, I would have done better. But so talk a little bit about how you got here, how you got to this place. And so Bonnie, let's start with you. You've been doing this, I think, the longest of everybody up here.
Yeah,
So.
yes, it's okay. Well, I grew up on a farm, and it was a pear farm in Oregon. And my father, first of all, both my parents were really supportive of education, and as one of my sisters right here in the front row, of education and science. And my father wanted to create the perfect pear. And so he worked with scientists at Oregon State, and we worked on how do you genetically change the pears and everything. And I became fascinated with trying to answer a question like that. And so I think it was his passion that became my passion to go into science. I had no intention of becoming an MD. I thought that I would become a PhD. Plus, I had no role models, really, as a woman. And when I was in college, one of my professors said, "You need to become an MD because you will starve if you're a PhD." and you can still do science as an MD, and you can actually afford to live. So that's why I became an MD.
Who else wants to share about their journey here? Any other pear farmers?
So I can say that I always feel like I'm an accidental scientist, like I'm not really supposed to be here. But I've always been really curious about everything, and I like to learn how things work. There's a little bit of engineering in that, but mostly there's just this curiosity to understand what makes something work, how is it built, how does it go together, how does it function. And through my life, I can say I study neurons now, but in the past I studied Klebsiella pneumoniae, which was yet another bacterium. And I studied that because I wanted to learn more about paramecia, which are little organisms that swim around. And I wanted to understand why their little cilia beat in one direction as opposed to another direction. And to do that, you have to grow the paramecia. And it turns out that the paramecia eat the Klebsiella, so you have to grow the Klebsiella. And I wound up killing the paramecia, but my Klebsiella were growing just great. And that was an opportunistic way for me to learn more about Klebsiella pneumoniae, which is a very robust bacteria, it turns out. So for me, I've had lots of little accidental circumstances like that. I came from a family that wasn't very highly educated, but they always encouraged fostering curiosity in everything you do and learn more about the world around you. So I feel like I've just kind of followed my own interests and curiosity where they take me, and in part due to a convergence of just my own experiences and things that inspire discovery and curiosity, it's taken me down a road for neuroscience. But there are a lot of other opportunities there, and it could have gone in a completely different direction. So, you know, I think that that's important to recognize, too, that some people have a burning desire on one specific area, but others are just inspired by whatever happens their way, and that's a great way to learn, too.
Nina, let me ask you, what would you now tell your younger self about choosing this journey and what to be mindful of or not worry about so much?
You know, I definitely suffered early on in my career of imposter syndrome. And I think, you know, having talked to many other scientists along the way, it's not an uncommon thing. I mean, luckily I didn't let it bother me too much, and I just kept going. But yeah, I think you know, you really can do everything, or you can do anything, and you know, when one door closes, another one opens. If you're you know, just willing to be open. And I think just not being afraid to take chances, I think, is one of the most important things.
Sumi, you're nodding, so can you weigh in?
Yeah,
on that?
I think sort of what's already been said, that the way, we're all up here on stage and with different backgrounds, and none of us knew we were going to be here at the end of high school. And it's just sort of a story of a meandering sort of journey through life that doesn't seem to have any clear direction, but you eventually get there. It's this path. And when I was in high school, I knew I wanted to do science, and then I got to college, and I thought, actually, I want to do physical anthropology, and took some classes, then maybe some astronomy, and so you kind of go off the path, and you come back, and it doesn't really matter, because wherever you end up, as long as you're interested and happy, that's all that really matters, and you just keep sticking with what drives you. Yeah.
And then, we hear so often, and certainly true for me, but for parents in the room, how often our kids may change majors in the first year or 2 or 4 years if they get to school. And so maybe some patience with that and that curiosity. Tala, what about for you?
Echoing a lot of what people have said already. I think what I would say to my younger self is that, so you see, I'm a planner. I like to think that I need to just do all of these things, and at the end, voila, what I was hoping for will come out. But it is true. If I look at my career, it's like I didn't know I was going to go this way, I was going to go this way, and being open to the possibilities that are out there. Sometimes you feel very vulnerable when that happens, but being open about that, and I think it's okay to sit with the ambiguity of all of it at times. That's sometimes quite uncomfortable, but I think just to sit with that. But most of all is to really try to figure out what it is that you love to do. Or what is it that you're passionate about? I feel like throughout, there are different expectations. Sometimes that you put on yourself, sometimes others put on you. Oh, you should do this. You're really good at this. Maybe you should be like this or like that or whatever. And you have this new opportunity. You should go after that. But I think that trying to figure out what is it that you really love to do. Maybe it's science. Maybe it's something else. Maybe it's arts. Maybe it's both. I mean, who says you can't do both? Being really open to that, and then trying to figure out being open to the life opportunities that allow you to then pursue those passions.
So I think that brings up a really good point about you all talked about the opportunities, which makes me think about the importance of mentors. And I wonder whether you each had them and what form that took. Maybe it was a family member, maybe it was a scientist, maybe it was a teacher, maybe it was none of the above. And if you did it make a difference? And if you didn't, have you missed it? So did any of you not have mentors?
I would say that I had less mentorship than I would have liked, and I actually had people telling me at various stages of my life, you can't do that. So I had people in college saying, well, you probably haven't taken enough chemistry at this time to go on to graduate school in what you're saying you want to do in molecular biology. And I look back on that and I think, oh my gosh, that's horrible. Who would tell somebody to not do something? But that happened. And I think it's important now, and we were talking a little bit about this as well, it's fabulous to have a mentor, and it's important to seek out mentors. And if you don't have a mentor, try to find one. But even if you don't give up. And find the strength within yourself. Do as much as you can on your own. And don't be discouraged if you can't find somebody to help you, because not everybody gets to have a strong mentor. And it definitely helps, but you can still make it if you don't. And I would also like to say to that there are still people that will discourage, and there are still people who, maybe subtly or, in ways that they don't even notice, might try to steer you in a different direction. As Tala said, sometimes it can be a little backhanded when people say, oh, but why do you want to do this? You're so good at this other thing. And that can be hard when you feel passionate about something that might be challenging. So you've got to follow your own spirit, and also stay committed even if others don't support you, if you know this is what you want.
Any of you want to share about a really fabulous mentor you had? I know, Bonnie, that you've talked about a partner anyway on your team. And
Yeah. Well, first I would say, as I said initially, I was extremely lucky to have parents that were very supportive of me, particularly my father, because this was in the 60s and 70s where women were not encouraged, and so that started it. But then as I became professional, there really were not many women role models around, and so, but I had male mentors that were equally supportive of a woman as they would be of a man, Arnie Smith and then Bob Bell, and they supported me for many years, and so I was very lucky that way. And I would say probably my greatest joy now as a senior woman scientist is that I can mentor lots of young women and men, and that is probably my biggest joy now, is being able to do that. And I will say, at least in my Department of Pediatrics, which is really a woman's department, mentoring is very much more formalized now, and everyone is helped to find a mentor. So that has come a long ways.
I'll say when and of course, people have been important throughout my life in education, but when I got to Seattle, there were a couple of people that have really been extremely important for my training, and one woman in particular is a senior neurologist in the department, and what she, has, her grants are always in the first percentile. She's extremely academically successful, but she will tell you if your socks don't match. And she will, remind you that your hair just doesn't look right, and aren't you supposed to be trimming it by now? And so there was this, and it was, at first you're sort of aghast, and then you realize that she is so badass. She is going to, get her NIH grant, and she's going to tell you what to wear. And I think that is so fabulous because she wasn't shying away from what she found was important, which is, so she wanted to dress well, and she would say things that we might consider to be more on the feminine side rather than the neutral or masculine side, and she was okay with it. And so that, I think, was one of the first times it struck me that it was, that there's room for both, to be a strong scientist and be a girly girl, if that behooves you. My socks never match. I get them from Costco, and that's just the way it is. And it's not because I'm trying to be a geek, it's just because I'm lazy. But I think the other aspect of mentoring is my current mentor and someone who had raised this idea of the imposter syndrome and is always very sensitive to this. So she brings in new women into the team or mentors people, and just reminding folks that have faith in yourself, that no one else is wondering if you're capable or not. It's only just you, and she's been very involved in all these sort of long-term decisions that go on into career development, and she's stuck with it not just for the couple of years that we've been working together in lab. So it's been really, really instrumental. Yeah.
I'm just seeing whether you wanted to share something, because otherwise I have a question for you.
Well, this is not really necessarily related to the mentor issue, but I think one of the things that I would say is unexpected that I've realized about this career of being a scientist is how much like a small business owner that you end up being. And I never thought I wanted to go into business, but actually a lot of what I do really is about that, because we have to raise funds. You have your idea that you have to pitch to raise funds, and then you have to recruit people to work with you because you can't do it all yourself. So you have to assemble a team. You have to mentor and do all these different things. And I think I've had a lot of good mentors along the way, maybe not so much in a very formal sense, but I think I've always looked to people around me and tried to see who has qualities that I admire, and are they doing things that I would like to incorporate. And so when I was in graduate school at Berkeley, there were very few women senior scientists, and 2 of them left while I was there. So, you know, in that case, I actually found male mentors that, you know, had families and had a mentoring style that I liked, and that's what I used as my mentor. So I guess I've always, you know, picked and chosen and seen where I'm at, and you know, what skills do I need, and can I see anybody around me that's doing something that I admire, and then, you know, kind of just try to draw from them. So, you know, maybe it's more similar to you in not having very specific mentors, but, you know, having to kind of pick out and pick qualities from different people around you.
And, you know, I think that's, I'm really glad you brought up the notion of sort of a small business owner, because I think that people don't realize that scientists have to raise their own funds. It's not as if you're going to work for Costco or, you know, a company in a sense. And Bonnie, maybe you could just give, for the people who are thinking about this, not to scare anyone, but the reality of life. I mean, you come up with an idea, and then where do you go for funding? Because people may not realize where this funding mainly comes from. Thinking of the government and things like that. So.
It depends on if you're doing like basic science, and you can go to either foundations. I mean, my area, there's a Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, but there's many, many different kinds of foundations. Or you go to the National Institutes of Health. But National Institutes of Health is not an easy place to get money, because they really like established scientists. It's a lot harder when you're starting out, so that takes time. If you're then, you know, developing a product similar to what has been described for diagnostics, then you may have to go out and partner with industry or venture capital or whatever. So you do have to be a small business person. So the one thing Dr. Smith told me is, you know, think of your research support as like a portfolio. He said, always have 1/3 in industry, have 1/3 in foundations, and 1/3 in NIH. And I've pretty much done that over the decades. And because, you know, so yeah, you have to manage that.
Yeah, but increasingly, I mean, as the funding tightens and the demands are higher, you know, I am just going to put in a plug for consideration for R&D funding from the U.S. government, the National Institutes of Health, and CDC and other places where this funding comes from. We don't realize it's a small percentage of what our taxpayer dollars go to, but it funds the sort of work that's going to impact and help all of our lives. We're going to be going soon to Q&A, and so, and I have a couple of questions from the audience as well, who submitted them earlier. So, and just as we're preparing for the questions, the mic there are 2 mics. There's one here that looks very sad, and I think we're going to fix it. And there's another one over here, so you can line up to think about asking your questions here. A question that we had is, what's been your greatest hardship in your career so far, and how did you overcome it? So, Sumi, you want to take that? Let's start.
Yeah, I think just sort of broadly or larger strokes, I think one of the most difficult things for me to understand in this whole racket is that you'll have an idea and you'll pitch it, and people might not bite at first. And I think what was hard was to realize that that's okay. You got to have a thick skin. You got to go back and you got to try again. And some people just need a little bit more convincing, or sometimes it's just a matter of time. And I've had grants that got, you know, totally bagged the first time, but then 2 years later, all of a sudden it was the best idea ever, and it got funded. So I think it's the idea of just having a thick skin and just keep rolling with it. This is a journey, and this is not a judgment. You know, science changes. Science is not a binary thing. This is seeped in culture and groupthink. So that was one of the hardest things.
Others, because I think this is a really interesting question.
I could comment on something that's more sort of rooted in the science, I suppose, is when you're working really hard on something and it's just not going your way. So particularly in the lab, you will have done everything right, you'll have set up your experiment right, you've read everything you need to know, you did well on the exam. And biology, or whether it's chemistry or whatever, it's just not working the way you imagined. And sometimes there's just things that can be so frustrating. You put in so much time, particularly researchers spend vast quantities of time for sometimes very small payoff. And there will be many times, if you are a scientist, where you sit at the bench, or you're reading something, you're studying something, you're working hard, and you will have despair. And you have to push through it. But those times, they're manyfold. You know, it's not as though there's one circumstance that can be demoralizing. There can be many. And kind of staying the course on doing what it is that you're doing, because you still really want to know that answer, even though it's elusive. And there have been many circumstances, particularly I think experimental biologists deal with this regularly. So it's kind of developing that emotional fortitude to see it through.
Yeah. I think for me, one of the difficulties in the line of work that we do is sometimes I want to get to the solution right away, and I want to fix the problem right now, and it takes a long time. And to me, this got, I think, driven home by one time I shadowed a team, a surveillance team. We went to Tanzania. And I saw what they got to do so that we can learn more about how we can design the right tools to serve the people we're trying to serve. And I looked at the situation and I'm thinking, wow, you know, like there's so many needs. The needs are so great in many of the communities, and I feel like our progress is so slow. So to me, when I'm faced with that, I was like, gosh, I'm not working hard enough. I need to work harder, you know, I need to rally more people. All of us need to get into this even more. And so it's both energizing, but also a little bit of a heartache. You feel like, oh gosh, I just wish I could do more.
All right, clearly there are plenty of questions, so we're going to get to those. Here's what I'm going to ask each of you. Keep your question concise, make it a question, and if it isn't a question, then I'm going to interrupt you, because I'm very bossy that way. So I'm going to start here, and then we'll go back and forth. And if you want to direct your question to one or two panelists in particular, otherwise people will just weigh in. So please, and say your name if you would.
Hi. I'm Kat, and this is for anyone who wants to answer it. So we're talking about grants, and once you get grants, so after that, you have to produce results. Can we talk about the importance of results and null results, and how you bring back those results so that you're doing the best science you can, and then afterwards you can still have work as a scientist? Mm-hmm.
Nina, we haven't heard from you in a bit.
So if I think I understand, so you're sort of asking if, you know, you get a grant for an idea and then you do the experiment and you basically don't get the result that you were expecting. How does one deal with that? You know, I get this question a lot, actually, from trainees. So first of all, the best experiments, basically either the yes or the no answer actually gives you new information that you can build on. So usually it's not as simple as that, black and white. There are sometimes situations where the results that you get go really against what the field thinks, and that can be, you know, very difficult to publish. And, you know, I've had people ask me, you know, is it okay to publish a null result because, you know, you're proving everybody else wrong, and isn't this really important to get out there? And that can be the case. I mean, usually, you know, people kind of think about this, you know, science fraud and, you know, truth and not truth. Usually, really, the situation is that we only understand things to the level at which we can measure them, and there's underlying assumptions, and sometimes a result is interpreted in one way, but as we get more information, we realize that that interpretation is wrong. Mm-hmm. So my usual strategy is to say of like, oh, you know, this is wrong. Can we figure out why it's wrong, or what is it about the underlying assumption that we can bring new understanding to? And then that's a more positive way of framing it, and you're usually more likely to be able to then get that published. Does that answer your question?
was beautifully said. I can't imagine a lot more to add, but I want to give that opportunity. Okay. All right. Let's go over here.
Hi, my name's Elizabeth. This is for any and all of you. There are a lot of attacks on science from the political realm these days, and I'm wondering what you see your role as scientists in trying to make sure that good public policy gets made.
You know, I'll take this one just because I just I just got back from the American Society of Microbiology's general meeting, and one of the things that was presented at the President's Forum and was the effort of that organization to basically try to get ahead of this. And so, for example, when this whole Zika virus problem emerged, they basically had a salon and brought in reporters and brought in scientists that work on, I think it's flaviviruses that are in the same family. I could have that wrong. I'm not a virologist. But to basically try to get local experts and to help reporters get the story right. And they felt like they were pretty effective in that endeavor. I think in the past, scientists have been a bit reactionary and kind of gotten caught in the crosshairs, but I think the community is starting to recognize this and starting to mobilize. And I think this example of the American Society of Microbiology saying, this is part of our mission, is to serve the public in this way and to provide meaningful and contextual information to policy leaders is a really great direction. But the other side of it is that media now is in this sort of instantaneous gotcha moment, and that, as we've just heard, is not the culture of science. And so I think it can be very difficult for us as scientists to react in the new realities of the media.
I know that this is a huge issue for many. People are trying to anticipate how to talk about some of this. And in global health, we're seeing on the Zika issue, and I am noticing that there's none of you are saying you love any particular viruses tonight. So viruses are feeling left out. But with Zika, the reaction is to take the money from Ebola. That was going to be used to strengthen the health systems across countries, and now address, it's robbing Peter to pay Paul along the way, is one of the things that's happening. Has anyone else given this some thought in terms of the political environment and how we think about research funding?
I think I just want to say that I think as scientists, we have to speak up. I mean, maybe it's just not in our nature to always be part of these kinds of discussions and be part of the fray. It's just not like, what do you mean? Isn't it obvious? Maybe it's our attitude and then we withdraw. That's not going to work, right? We have to be part of this. We don't pay attention to things like advocacy, but we need advocates. We need to present evidence. We need to learn how to talk, the talk that gets heard. So I think, for me, this is still a learning process, but I think that's just coming from that realization that we do need to advocate. We do need to get across the message about science so that other people who are not telling the truth, they don't get to dominate the headlines, and they don't get to dominate the airwaves.
So I wanted to add to that just a little bit, because sometimes the focus is also on the immediacy of an outbreak, or on something that is a clinically diagnosed problem or symptom or disease. And I think a lot of scientists will be quick to say that there's a huge importance to basic research as the basis upon which discovery can flourish. And it's the same thing when thinking about public information. There is the sort of headline-grabbing sound bites that you'll hear, and oftentimes the hard work that goes into the fundamental information that does provide a little bit more meat on the bones of understanding what is the real story is not well understood. And not everybody has to be an expert, but people should have an appreciation of the fact that to Tala's point again, there are not necessarily going to be quick answers or simple one-liners that can address complex problems, particularly as many of the scientific items that are part of the agenda now are really complex. They're highly integrated. They move in just from not only a technical perspective, but also a socio-political perspective. So these are complex, and they require, complex solutions that do pull on many different disciplines of science, of policy, and bringing those people together to have those conversations and work on solutions is key. And not assuming that there's just going to be one conversation and you can move on. Getting people to understand that is a challenge, I think.
Yeah. And it is an era of sound bites, and so thinking about your audience. Bonnie, I know you had something that you maybe wanted to add there, and then I want to try to get to the rest of the questions here too.
Well, I just think, since being both a scientist and a physician, I think always having to talk to families has helped me understand some of the keys that, as a scientist, you tend to get defensive if someone doesn't understand what you're saying. And you have to think about, from their perspective, what do they understand, what are they hearing? And so I think there is, you do have to have a lot of training in understanding your audience and being able to communicate with them.
Great. Next question.
Hi, I'm Molly, and I'm in my second year of science PhD school, graduate school. And there's a perception among young scientists, particularly young female scientists, that to be in positions of authority and leadership, as you are in science, that you have to sacrifice a huge amount of your personal life or other aspects of what you imagine your life to be in the future. And I was just wondering what you would say to young scientists who had that perspective, and how you've dealt with that feeling as well.
I know there are a number of mothers and
Yeah, I mean, I think the advice that I always tell people is that it's not an easy road to try to balance a career, a passion, and your work. But that's true in the arts. It's true in business. It's true in many fields. I think the challenge is you have to decide what's important to you, what you want to accomplish, and then build in the ways that you're going to make that work. So, if you're in the middle of your PhD, you know that you have to work long hours sometimes, and I don't know what exactly your field is, but in my case, the bacteria don't necessarily, wait to do what they want to do when I want them to do it. Sometimes you have to wait on them. And so, if you're going to have kids, then you have to build in contingencies. And how's that going to be? Am I going to have family that's going to provide support? Am I going to hire in support? What things do I want to do? What things am I going to farm out? I mean, you have to make decisions.
I just want to add too, though, that yes, we have to make decisions, and it's very important to figure out where we want to go. But I would just say, be very careful of false choices.
Yes, I would agree with that.
That sometimes people put things in a very binary mode, either this or that. You can't be both. Well, why not? And maybe there are other options than the two in front of you. So I would just say, figure out what you want, put out the plan, work towards it. Know that sometimes you have to sacrifice. But sometimes the sacrifice is short-term, it's not long-term. Just because you decide to do this now doesn't mean you know. So I think you just have to be, I guess more than anything, just be careful about potentially false options that you see in front of you.
how many of you have kids? Yeah. So, okay, can be done. Go ahead.
I don't know where they are, but
Yeah, well, that's
Hi, my name is Cassie Wallander, and like many of us in Seattle, I'm in software. But I'm really interested to know how us in tech can support your guys' innovation in medicine. So my question is, for those of you who do clinical trials, aside from patient recruitment, what's the biggest challenges you're facing?
Bonnie, I'm going
in clinical trials specifically.
In clinical trials, okay, great.
In clinical trials.
The biggest challenge?
For tech, that where
What are
tech
the
might...
biggest challenges that you're facing?
Looking at across another half of my life, non-CF is working in developing systems for clinical trials in general. And the biggest challenge really is recruitment of patients. Not so much in a small field like mine, but in general, identifying patients. But now with better access to electronic medical records, that's coming a long ways. Also retention of patients in trials. I think this is a field that's been totally revolutionized by technology. The data management tools and so forth have completely changed. But now with, linking up omics, and we have such massive amounts of data, management of that is somewhat difficult. But I think really, it's really getting to the patients that's the challenge. I don't know what other people in clinical trials have found.
Agree.
Yeah.
Apparently. Okay.
I would agree.
Yeah.
I would
Okay.
agree, yeah.
Great. I will say also in terms of the tech industry, we're looking at standardization of the ways that we measure health outcomes, whether it's domestically and internationally. And it's been really fun. We've been working with the Gates Foundation, PATH, Amazon Web Services, the Hutch, and others to think about, and the Allen Brain Institute, my wonderful friend Jane Roscom's here, about thinking about how can we not only standardize that data and collect it, but so that we're comparing apples to apples. So that's a really fun project we're just starting to think about, thanks to Jane. So great, go right ahead.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm a sophomore at Carnegie Mellon studying biochemistry, and I'm going to ask you the question that has become the bane of my existence. A couple of you have mentioned paths changing and why not both, and so I'm curious, what do you see yourself doing in the future?
Yeah.
Hopefully sleeping at some point tonight, right? Sumi.
Well, I know now that I'm here, I know that no matter what I do, I'm going to be enjoying it, because I realize that is what that is the only career decision I have to make. Is that the commitment is just to be enjoying it and loving life, and I assume I'll still be in science, but I'll be open. I don't know, but I imagine that's where I'll be.
Anybody else? Bonnie?
Well, I'm having to deal actually with what do you do when you're coming towards the end of your career, and I think I will, to some extent, stay in science for another 5 to 10 years, but I think most of what I would like to do is just continue teaching. So, yeah, I don't see myself suddenly going off on a new career at this point.
Amy, you've had such an eclectic experience. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a month and a half into a completely different thing than I was doing 2 months ago. So I can tell you, if you'd asked me that question 3 months ago, I would have said, well, I'm doing the same thing I'm always doing. I'm leading some laboratory teams. And now I'm working more on a development of a product where I need to think as the end user scientist, but also from the perspective of how to develop this knowledge product. And I can tell you, because I got my degree in biochemistry and molecular biology, that if I was to have asked my now self then what I was doing, I would have said, well, I don't know, I'm probably going to be working in a lab, isolating this particular phosphatase that I'm isolating as part of my graduate work. But, to the point of doing something you love at the time, that was everything I wanted to be doing. And as you evolve in what you're doing, you start seeing new doors opening up, and you kind of create that path for yourself. So at this point, I'm really focused on what's ahead of me in the next sort of 6 months to a year. And maybe that's not as reassuring to people who want to plan out their whole career ahead of them, but there are so many opportunities and there's so much to work with and so much to learn even within that time frame that I'm comfortable with that. But it's true that, to what you've been hearing as well, you've got to be open to everything in order to seize what comes up that is exciting to you at that moment. And I hope right now it's biochemistry, but who knows?
Listen to what Kala had said earlier. All right, now we're going to move sort of into the lightning round because we've got less than 10 minutes left. I want to make sure everybody gets to ask their questions, so we'll just go as quickly as we can. Go ahead.
So my name is Margaret, and as some of you have said before, it used to be a lot more difficult for women to be in the sciences. They were shunned and stuff. So if you were a man, do you think that a lot of the opportunities and experiences that you got to have would have been different?
Boy, I wish I just had a photo of everybody's facial reaction there.
So I'm going to take this. You know, I don't feel like being a woman stopped me. So yeah, I just did it, and maybe it did in some small ways. Maybe my path would have been a little bit different, but I've basically gotten to do what I wanted to do.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. My name is Tesla, and I was wondering how old were you when you started, and what inspired you to continue?
That's a tough one because I don't know when I started, right? I mean, the path is, you know, I got interested in science as a kid and then just kind of kept studying it in different ways and then ended up where I am. I think what kept me going are the discoveries and the eureka moments. And some of those eureka moments are in the lab. Some of them were in the classroom of, you know, discovering some really, you know, having a teacher tell you about something that blows your mind. So, so for me, the fun parts are the eureka moments, and that's what drives me.
Anybody else want to?
Can I like to think of science as not so much a career, but as who you are. So you're always going to be excited by something. I know that when I was a little kid, as far back as I can remember, I got really into playing on the beach and comparing the different hermit crabs and what kind of shells they had. And you just start thinking of experiments to figure out, well, what makes one hermit crab have this kind of shell as opposed to this shell? Oh, well, if I put two shells there, maybe it will choose one or the other. That's a scientific experiment. And you find yourself doing these things just without even trying. So I think a lot of us have always had the questions in our mind, and then how you develop your career can formalize some of that. And it's hard to pick one particular time when you start. And I don't think it's possible to ever really stop.
I think you've already started. So thanks for the question. Yes.
I'm Meredith Stewart, and obviously I can't top my sister's question, Margaret, about you guys being male, but I want to know, especially with Ms. Tala and talking about eliminating the parasite, why would we want to eliminate it, especially in the terms of malaria, where malaria is carried by mosquitoes, and that's a very vital part of the food chain. I want to know why we would want to eliminate something like that.
So let me talk about the river blindness one, and I'll try to make my answer brief. It's not that we don't necessarily see it that we're not talking about mosquitoes. We're not talking about eliminating mosquitoes. In that case, we're trying to eliminate the parasite that causes the disease in people. In that case, actually, the parasite happens to be transmitted by black flies. They're going to be part of the environment. But we're trying to remove the parasites so that when the black flies bite another person, they're not picking up those parasites and transmitting them to the other. And why are we eliminating them? Because those parasites wreak havoc on the lives of the people that they're infecting. I mean, it was such a common sight before in those communities where you have a young child leading a person in their 30s sometimes, up to their 50s with a stick because the entire adult population has gone blind. So I think that, to me, yes, we have to eliminate the diseases because these diseases really target the most vulnerable members of our community, and we want to give them the chance to have productive lives like we do here.
And the good news for you is that there'll be people to ask more about the malaria. If you read a little bit about the mosquito, and when we think about Zika or dengue or malaria, these mosquito-borne diseases, people are trying to come up. There's some pretty interesting solutions. some of them over at Global Good over in Bellevue, where they're trying to zap different kinds of mosquitoes or breed some out and all of that sort of thing. So there's some creative solutions happening, but you have to think about the impact, and then you think about it in terms of the food chain and all of that. So anyway, so that not a satisfactory answer is a really great question, and but hopefully there'll be some people here who can follow up with you afterward as well. Okay, thank you.
Hi, I'm Phil Russell. Thank you very much for great presentations. Artificial intelligence and big data are two technologies that seem to be taking off to the point where they're producing, useful results. What are your thoughts on how they can be applied to support scientific research and discovery? And to the degree you think they potentially could be useful, how can young people who are thinking about entering into a scientific discipline today get better prepared to use those tools as they take on a career?
Okay, I have to say something because this is what we do at the Allen Institute. This is why, one of the reasons why we are who we are is we believe in the power of large quantities of data informing questions and addressing challenges that simply cannot be addressed through piecemeal, single piece by piece data approaches. So standardization of data, integration of data formats, standardization and systematic approaches to generating data allows you to discover more about individual measurable phenomena that cannot be done individually. And having very robust integration between data acquisition that comes from the level of quantitation and capturing raw pieces of information, translating that using strong computational and informatic tools requires cross-training in either the biosciences or if that's your area of interest, as well as computer sciences and mathematics. So intersecting these fields, I cannot emphasize enough, it's sort of the sole piece of information when people ask me what to study or what they should do. I say, study both computer sciences and whatever your bioscience or chemical sciences or industrial sciences you're interested in, put those together, because that's where the field is going. That's actually where the field already is. And you will never have a lack of both professional opportunities as well as personal opportunities for learning to put those together. And in terms of the AI component, I mean, that will not fit into a small answer, so you can talk more about that if you want. But
follow up with that afterward.
But putting those skills together is what's essential now.
Great. Now, in the interest of time, here's what I'm going to ask is, would you each ask your question, just you two, and then we'll have people take, we'll make sure each of them is answered, but I do want to give everybody an opportunity. So would you just ask your question and then step away and let the young women behind you ask?
Do you have any advice for people who have a passion for a certain scientific field, but they don't actually think they're good at it, or they have trouble understanding different ideas and stuff?
Hi, what's the most difficult parasite you ever worked with?
Okay.
We know that recruiting for studies is really difficult. I'm wondering, what's the most unique way that you have recruited a study participant, and what was it?
Hi, I was wondering, what sort of advice would you give to someone who is possibly going into science at kind of a later stage in their life, of not necessarily going into beginning of university, but say in their early 20s, and then they want to get into a scientific field? How would be the best way to go about that?
Okay, so let's do the parasite one first. That's easy, and then the harder ones later. So the parasite, yeah, I think we know who's answering that.
I'll take the parasite one. I think Vivax, for malaria, Vivax, because it's difficult because you can take the drugs, but they treat the symptoms, but they don't necessarily get rid of the parasite. You have to get quote-unquote radical cure. You have to take a particular class of drugs to totally get rid of the parasite. But certain people have deficiency in an enzyme that if they take the drug, then they have a hemolytic shock, or they have an adverse, a severe reaction against the drug. So I think that's one of the ones, as we think about malaria elimination, eliminating malaria due to Vivax is going to be challenging because of this situation.
Bonnie, can you take the one, the young man who asked about switching a little later? which I think is so young. But
Yeah. That was my reaction too.
Yes.
20s is not old.
I think, I'm not sure, I don't know that I have
somebody else want to
easy
take it?
answer for that.
Actually, when I was a postdoc, one of my fellow colleagues had a career in journalism and then switched to science and went to graduate school. And actually, I have another friend that is a professor at UC San Diego that was a stand-up comic for a number of years. He's always very funny at meetings. So yeah, I mean, I think if you want to change directions, that's fine. And the first things that you need to do if you don't have enough science in your background, maybe you're going to have to go to community college and beef that up, and then move on the path. But I'd say go for it.
Can I add to that too,
Yeah.
in terms of moving on the path? Jump into a job as soon as you possibly can.
Yeah.
Just do it. Just find a job in whatever area it is and start it, even if it's small or seems boring, start doing it, and you can step it up from there.
Yeah.
But just don't wait until you feel like you have the perfect alignment of classes. I think sometimes people, particularly in the sciences, wait till they, I have to get through this training and that training before I can even start. No, just start now with something. Build the experience.
Yeah, be a dishwasher, volunteer in the lab.
All right, the clinical trial question. If somebody wants to take that one, Simi, do you want to?
I don't know about very interesting ways of stalking people to get them into clinical trials, but I do think there are some key things. You got to make it reasonable for them to want to do it, and so you really got to have a justified clinical trial to be doing. But really, it's all about communication. It's kind of like, we're all out here spending our evenings, talking to each other, and it's about getting to know the community so the community knows who we are, and forming that relationship. And I think our progress in biomedical research is really a partnership with our patients, and and that's what makes it fruitful. So.
Yeah,
Well,
I think there's more use of social media now that helps with recruitment. I mean, I'm in an easy situation because it's a defined population where you have a personal relationship. But if that's not it, I think getting it out there on social media, I mean, there's a lot of national networks, like ClinTrials and so forth, but I actually think Facebook works a lot better, so.
And actually, it's a perfect segue, and I am going to end on that other question, which hurt my heart, and so I'm confident that you all are going to take that. But on the clinical trial, Elizabeth Duke is here? Great. Would you come on up and talk about your clinical trial at the Hutch and how anyone here can sign up?
So perhaps this is the most interesting way to recruit someone for But I work with a group that is trying to develop new treatments for falciparum malaria and also vaccines. And we're currently looking to recruit healthy people ages 18 to 45 who aren't pregnant. So if you're at all interested in that, I would love to talk to you. Also, seattlemalaria.org is a website where you can sign up.
Great. So you can get malaria, and you can get malaria, and you can get malaria. So I think everybody should sign up. And the most poignant question, and something that I know I've struggled with, I'm just going to let you each go down because I think it's a really good way to end. So Tala.
Yeah, I want to say, still go back to do what you love. Because I will share with you that when I finished college and I was applying for grad school, and I had my list of grad schools that I wanted to go to, and I went to ask for a recommendation letter from my favorite biochem professor, and she looked at my list of schools and said I wasn't good enough for them. And it totally crushed my heart. So I revised, had another list, and fortunately I had another mentor whom I approached, and then he looked at my list and said, oh, this is a weird collection of schools. You have some really good ones and some like, I don't know why you want to apply there. And I told him my experience, and he said, forget it. Don't listen to that. Apply to where you wanted to. Give me your first list. So, and I applied, and I'm so glad I did that because I got into all of them except for one.
I think when somebody tells you you can't do something or you're not good enough about that, they're probably talking more about themselves than about you.
I guess I would just want to take that. I mean, if you feel like if there's like a class and you're not getting it, it could just be that you learn in a different way than that person is delivering. And so if it's something that you're really interested in, go seek other people out or other styles out. I mean, I sort of experienced this firsthand. So when you're in graduate school, one of the things that you have to do is you have to be a TA. And I was TAing this biochemistry lab, and I was trying to explain to this group how to get dilution, to do this dilution series. And they didn't get it the way that I was explaining it. And then I couldn't, on the spot, I couldn't think of a different way to explain it. So I just kept saying the same thing louder and louder. And they didn't get it. But then later, I regrouped and I figured out a different way to explain it. So I just would say don't get discouraged.
Yeah, I think people have talked about the imposter syndrome, but I think everybody feels inside that they're not really secure. I mean, even this year when I got into the National Academy, I mean, obviously I was blown away, but I thought they must have made a mistake. So, I mean, I think everyone feels that way. When I was in medical school, I went and worked in a lab, and I said, I don't want to be paid for 6 months because what I want to know is whether I can do science or not. And if I get paid, then you'll treat me like a lab technician, and I'd had 19 lab technician jobs. So I had to do that for myself. And at the end, this person said to me, you are made to be a scientist. And up until that time, I never thought I would. So you do have to find someone else if you're not getting that. Everybody feels insecure, and everybody gets negative data. And you'll have many more failures than you will successes, but you have to believe in yourself.
That's so well said, but the point is you're here today. Yeah. And that's 95% of it.
I guess I also wanted to highlight the fact that sometimes people who think scientifically tend to be perfectionists. I know a lot of them, I work with a lot of them, and sometimes we get hung up on the details of, if it's about achieving 100% on an exam and you've only got 80 or maybe 90 for some people, you think, oh, I didn't do as well as I could, or maybe I'm not really understanding this as well as I should. And in reality, if you understand what it is that you need to understand to get you to the next step, it's maybe good enough. And we don't always like the term good enough, and if it's always just barely good enough, maybe that's not good either. But sometimes it's about getting through something so you understand enough so you can move to that next step. And it doesn't necessarily correlate with the highest level grade or with everybody congratulating you, but it's part of the process. And I think it's really easy for us sometimes to get hung up on the absolutes, and that's not what it's all about. So, you got to stick with it. You've got to have a lot of inner strength, and you've got to learn to deal with disappointment, but not let it get you down, and instead just see it as a challenge to help you identify where it is you have to go.
So as we wrap up this evening, I wanted to highlight again that we have had these 5 astonishing women rock star scientists here. We also have a number of others in the audience, and I would like all the women scientists, all the scientists who are here tonight, to stand up, please.